The silver necklace that changed everything hung delicately around Grace Thompson's neck as she pushed through the automated doors of Boston General Hospital at 5:47 a.m., unaware that this Tuesday would shatter every assumption she'd ever made about her life. The familiar scent of antiseptic and industrial coffee hit her as she clocked in for another 12-hour shift. At 32, Grace had spent the last 8 years walking these sterile corridors, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the polished linoleum. The delicate silver chain at her throat caught the harsh fluorescent lights, the only piece of jewelry she ever wore, the only tangible memory of the mother she'd lost when she was just 3 years old. "Thompson, you're on the VIP wing today," Nurse Supervisor Patricia Mills announced without looking up from her clipboard, her voice carrying that familiar edge of disdain. "Try not to embarrass us in front of the donors." Grace felt the familiar tightness in her chest, but simply nodded. Patricia had made it clear from day one that Grace didn't belong among the hospital's elite staff. Too quiet, too humble, too ordinary for the prestigious 7th floor, where Boston's wealthiest received their medical care, in suite-like rooms with marble bathrooms and panoramic city views. As she gathered her supplies, Grace caught her reflection in the supply room's glass cabinet. The necklace gleamed against her pale green scrubs, a simple chain with an intricate silver pendant, worn smooth by decades of touch. She remembered tracing its delicate engravings as a child in her foster home, creating elaborate stories about the mysterious woman who'd left it behind. The social workers had told her it was the only thing found with her at the hospital where she'd been abandoned, but Grace had always sensed there was more to the story. The elevator to the 7th floor felt longer today, each floor number illuminating like a countdown to something she couldn't name. When the doors opened, she was greeted by the sight of luxury that still made her feel like an intruder: mahogany furniture, original artwork, and floor-to-ceiling windows that made the city sprawl below look like a kingdom waiting to be claimed. "Nurse Thompson," Dr. Harrison approached with his usual brisk efficiency. "You'll be primary care for Mrs. Eleanor Davenport in room 701. She's scheduled for cardiac surgery tomorrow morning. Fair warning, she's particular." Grace had heard the name whispered in hospital corridors. Eleanor Davenport, 82 years old, billionaire heiress to the Davenport shipping empire. A woman so wealthy she could buy the hospital 3 times over, yet so isolated that she allegedly trusted no one except her team of lawyers and financial advisors. The nurses called her the Ice Queen, beautiful even in her 80s, but with eyes that could freeze summer rain. Room 701 sat at the end of the hall like a fortress. Grace knocked gently before entering, her heart performing an unexpected flutter as she stepped into what looked more like a luxury hotel suite than a hospital room. Eleanor Davenport sat by the window in an elegant silk robe, her silver hair styled perfectly despite her upcoming surgery, her hands folded with practiced composure. "Mrs. Davenport? I'm Grace Thompson, your nurse for—" The words died in her throat as Eleanor's pale blue eyes lifted to meet hers. But it wasn't Grace's face that held the woman's attention, it was her neck. Eleanor's composed expression cracked like ice under sudden heat, her eyes widening with what looked like recognition, shock, and something deeper. Something that resembled grief. The silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. Grace instinctively touched the pendant at her throat, a gesture she'd made thousands of times. But now it felt different, weighted with significance she couldn't understand. "Where?" Eleanor's voice came out as barely a whisper. Then stronger. "Where did you get that necklace?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Grace felt the room shift around her, as if the very atmosphere had changed density. Outside the window, Boston continued its morning rush, oblivious to the fact that inside room 701, 2 women were staring at each other across a chasm that felt both infinite and suddenly, inexplicably bridgeable. "It was my mother's," Grace replied automatically, her hand still protectively covering the pendant. "It's the only thing I have of her." Eleanor Davenport rose from her chair with surprising grace for a woman facing surgery, moving closer with steps that seemed to echo with decades of authority and power. But her eyes, those famous ice blue eyes that had stared down corporate boards and intimidated world leaders, now held something Grace had never expected to see from someone of Eleanor's stature, fear. "Tell me," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the weight of buried secrets. "What do you know about your mother?" Grace felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. In all her years of nursing, through every crisis and emergency, she had never felt her hands shake. But now, under Eleanor Davenport's intense gaze, with questions she'd carried her entire life, suddenly hanging in the air between them, her fingers trembled against the silver pendant that had become, in the space of a heartbeat, so much more than a simple piece of jewelry. It had become a key to a door she never knew existed. The preoperative procedures should have been routine, checking vitals, reviewing medication lists, explaining tomorrow's cardiac surgery timeline. Instead, Grace found herself moving through Eleanor's room like she was walking through a minefield, hyper-aware of every gesture, every glance, every breath. Eleanor had retreated to her window chair after that loaded question about Grace's mother, but her eyes continued to track Grace's movements with laser focus. The intensity of that stare made Grace's skin prickle with nervous energy, as if she were being studied under a microscope by someone searching for specific cellular evidence. "Your mother," Eleanor repeated when Grace approached with the blood pressure cuff. "You said you know nothing about her." Grace secured the cuff around Eleanor's surprisingly strong arm, noting how the woman's pulse quickened despite her outward composure. "I was found at Boston Children's Hospital when I was 3. No identification, no family, just..." She gestured to her necklace. "This. Found where, exactly?" The question carried such sharp precision that Grace paused, her finger hovering over the blood pressure monitor's start button. In 32 years, no one had ever asked for specific details about her abandonment. Foster families focused on the future, social workers on paperwork, friends on moving past painful histories, but Eleanor Davenport seemed to need coordinates. The emergency room waiting area, according to my file. Her janitor discovered me asleep in one of the chairs around midnight. They estimated I'd been there for hours. Grace's voice grew quieter with each detail, memories she'd tried to bury surfacing like debris after a storm. I kept asking for Mama, but couldn't provide any other information. Eleanor's blood pressure reading came back elevated, not dangerously so, but higher than expected for someone in pre-op rest. Grace made a note in the chart while Eleanor continued her interrogation. "The necklace, may I see it more closely?" Warning bells chimed in Grace's mind, but something about Eleanor's tone, not demanding despite her obvious wealth and power, but almost pleading, made her comply. She lifted the chain over her head for the first time in years, feeling strangely naked without its familiar weight. Eleanor's hands shook slightly as she accepted the necklace, and Grace noticed how carefully the older woman handled it, as if it were made of spun glass rather than silver. Eleanor held the pendant up to the afternoon light, streaming through the window, examining the intricate engravings that Grace had memorized through decades of absent-minded tracing. "The craftsmanship is exquisite," Eleanor murmured, her voice thick with an emotion Grace couldn't identify. "European. Probably Italian, given the technique used for these tiny roses along the border." Grace blinked in surprise. She'd always assumed the engravings were simply decorative swirls, but as Eleanor traced them with a manicured finger, Grace could suddenly see what she'd missed. Delicate roses intertwined with initials so small they were almost invisible. "E.M. E.M., Grace whispered, leaning closer despite herself. "I never noticed." "Eleanor Margaret," Eleanor said so softly Grace almost missed it. "Those were my daughter's initials." The words hit Grace like a physical force, stealing her breath and making the luxury hospital room spin slightly around its edges. She gripped the arm of Eleanor's chair to steady herself, her mind racing to process what she'd just heard. "Your daughter." Eleanor nodded, her fingers still curved protectively around the pendant. "Catherine Eleanor Margaret Davenport. She disappeared 29 years ago with my granddaughter." Eleanor's voice broke on the last words, decades of controlled composure finally cracking. "They were never found." Grace felt her legs weaken and sank into the visitor's chair beside Eleanor's window seat. The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. 29 years ago, Grace would have been 3 years old, the age she was when found at the hospital. The age when her memories began. What happened to them? Eleanor's gaze returned to the Boston skyline, but Grace sensed she was seeing something far beyond the city's borders. "Catherine married someone I didn't approve of. We fought. Terrible cutting words were exchanged, the kind you can never take back." Her voice grew distant, heavy with regret. "She took her daughter and left in the middle of the night. I was too proud to go after them, too certain they'd come back when their money ran out, But they never did. No. The private investigators found traces, a rental car abandoned in Providence, some credit card charges in Hartford, then nothing. It was as if they'd simply vanished from existence. Eleanor lifted the necklace again, studying it like a compass that might finally point her toward answers. This belonged to Catherine. I gave it to her on her 18th birthday. Had it custom-made in Florence with her initials. She never took it off. Grace's mouth felt cotton dry as the implications crystallized around her like gathering storm clouds. What was your granddaughter's name? Helena's eyes met hers directly, and in them Grace saw 3 decades of loss, hope, and desperate longing focused into a single, laser-sharp point of recognition. Grace, Eleanor whispered. Her name was Grace Catherine Davenport. The world tilted completely off its axis. Grace gripped the chair arm so hard her knuckles went white, her breath coming in short. Sharp gasps as everything she'd ever believed about her identity crumbled and reformed around this impossible possibility. Outside room 701, the hospital continued its daily rhythm of healing and hope, unaware that inside, 2 women were staring at each other across a chasm of 29 years, connected by a silver thread that had never truly been broken. The cardiac monitor's steady beeping provided the only sound in room 701 as Grace stared into Eleanor Davenport's eyes, searching for lies, for manipulation, for any sign that this was an elaborate mistake. Instead, she found only raw vulnerability from a woman who clearly hadn't shown such emotion in decades. "That's impossible," Grace whispered. But even as she spoke, her hands moved unconsciously to touch the necklace Eleanor still held. "I would remember. I would remember you." Eleanor's smile carried the weight of unshed tears. "You were so young. And Catherine," her voice caught. "Catherine was terrified of me by the end. She probably told you never to speak my name." Grace's mind reeled through fragmented early memories, flashes of a woman with dark hair singing lullabies, hands that smelled like vanilla, teaching her to braid ribbons, a voice that grew increasingly frightened as days passed. She'd always attributed these scattered recollections to wishful thinking, the desperate fabrications of a child who needed to believe she'd once been loved. "The woman who raised me," Grace said slowly, pieces clicking into place like a puzzle solving itself. "She wasn't my mother. Catherine was your mother." "My daughter." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes scanning Grace's features with new intensity. "You have her chin, her hands. But your eyes, those are Davenport eyes." "My eyes," before Grace could respond. A sharp knock interrupted them. Dr. Harrison entered with his usual brisk efficiency, followed by Patricia Mills, whose expression immediately soured when she saw Grace sitting rather than working. "Mrs. Davenport, I hope Nurse Thompson isn't bothering you with unnecessary conversation," Patricia began. But Eleanor's raised hand stopped her mid-sentence. "Dr. Harrison." Eleanor's voice had returned to its commanding tone, though Grace noticed the slight tremor in her fingers as she handed the necklace back. "I need to speak with you about postponing tomorrow's surgery." "Postpone." Dr. Harrison frowned, checking his tablet. "Mrs. Davenport, we've scheduled the entire cardiac team. Your condition requires—" "My condition can wait 72 hours. Eleanor's tone brooked no argument. "I have urgent family business that requires my attention." Patricia's eyebrows shot up. "Family business?" "Mrs. Davenport, our records show you have no living relatives." Eleanor's gaze found Grace's, and in that look Grace saw a question, a hope and a terrifying invitation to step into a life she'd never imagined. "Possible. That information may need updating," Eleanor said quietly. The silence that followed was thick with implications. Dr. Harrison looked between Eleanor and Grace with growing confusion, while Patricia's face cycled through disbelief, calculation, and barely concealed fury. "I don't understand," Dr. Harrison said. "Are you saying you've discovered a family member?" Grace felt the moment stretch like a bridge across a canyon. She could retreat to the safety of her familiar life, dismiss this as an elderly woman's pre-surgical delusion, or step forward into territory that might destroy everything she thought she knew about herself. "Dr. Harrison," Grace heard herself say, her voice stronger than she felt, "I need to request personal leave, starting immediately." Patricia's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Personal leave? Thompson, you can't just abandon your patients because a wealthy..." Donor has taken a liking to you. She's not abandoning anyone. Eleanor's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to reshaping reality through sheer will. Nurse Thompson will be attending to urgent family matters. I'll ensure the hospital is compensated for any inconvenience. Family matters? Patricia's voice rose dangerously. Dr. Harrison, this woman has no family. She's a foster child who's clearly trying to manipulate. Enough. Eleanor rose from her chair with surprising grace, every inch the billionaire heiress despite her hospital gown. Dr. Harrison, I'll need complete copies of my medical records transferred to my personal physician by end of business today. Patricia, is it? You'll find your concerns about Nurse Thompson's employment status will be handled through proper administrative channels. The dismissal was absolute. Patricia's face flushed red, but she recognized the futility of arguing with someone who could buy the hospital without affecting her quarterly budget. Dr. Harrison simply nodded, his expression carefully neutral as he made notes on his tablet. As they left, Patricia shot Grace a look that promised future retribution, but Grace barely noticed. She was staring at Eleanor, who had moved back to the window and was gazing out at Boston with an expression Grace couldn't read. You don't have to do this, Grace said when they were alone. Change your surgery. Involve me in whatever this is. We don't even know for certain. I know. Eleanor turned back and the certainty in her voice was unshakable. I've spent 29 years looking for you, Grace Catherine Davenport. I've hired investigators, funded missing persons networks, followed leads that took me to 3 continents and dozens of dead ends. She gestured to the necklace, now back around Grace's neck where it belonged. That pendant is one of only 2 ever made. The other one is in my jewelry box at home, waiting for the daughter who never came back to claim it. Grace's hand moved instinctively to the silver at her throat. What if you're wrong? What if I'm not who you think I am? Eleanor's smile was sad but determined. Then I'll have spent 3 days getting to know a remarkable young woman who reminds me of everything I lost. But Grace, she paused, her voice becoming gentle in a way that made Grace's chest ache. What if I'm right? The question hung in the air between them like a dare, like a promise, like the beginning of a story that could rewrite both their lives completely. Outside, Boston hummed with its daily rhythms, but inside room 701, time seemed suspended as 2 women prepared to dive into waters that would either drown them in disappointment or carry them home to each other after nearly 3 decades apart. Eleanor's Beacon Hill mansion stood like a fortress of old Boston money, its federal-style brick facade and perfectly manicured gardens speaking of centuries-old wealth that had survived economic crashes, wars, and changing dynasties. As Grace followed Eleanor up the marble steps that afternoon, she felt like she was entering a museum where she might accidentally touch something worth more than her annual salary. I haven't had overnight guests in 15 years, Eleanor admitted, as she led Grace through doors that whispered expensive on their hinges. My housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, is beside herself with excitement. The interior was exactly what Grace had expected, oriental rugs over gleaming hardwood, crystal chandeliers catching afternoon light, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to follow their movement through rooms that could house entire families. But what surprised Grace were the subtle signs of loneliness: a single coffee cup beside an overstuffed reading chair, photographs turned face down on side tables, rooms that felt preserved rather than lived in. The library is where we'll find what we need, Eleanor said, guiding Grace down a hallway lined with more paintings. I've kept everything, every report, every lead, every dead end. If you're truly Catherine's daughter, the evidence will be there. The library was Eleanor's sanctuary, Grace realized immediately. Unlike the museum-perfect sitting rooms, this space felt alive. Books pulled from shelves and stacked on tables, reading glasses perched on various surfaces, a fire crackling in the marble fireplace despite the September warmth. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the private garden, where late afternoon sun painted everything golden. Eleanor moved to an antique desk and withdrew a key from her jacket pocket. I haven't opened this in 2 years, she murmured, unlocking a drawer that seemed to exhale decades of hope and heartbreak when it slid open. Inside were manila folders, organized with obsessive precision. Private investigators, 1996-2010, missing persons database searches, hospital records requests, DNA testing services. Each tab represented years of Eleanor's life, spent searching for people who had vanished as completely as morning mist. Here, Eleanor lifted out a folder marked Catherine and Grace Personal Items and set it on the mahogany desk between them. These are copies of everything I had from before they disappeared. Grace's breath caught as Eleanor opened the folder to reveal photographs she'd never seen. A young woman who looked strikingly like Grace, but with darker hair and Eleanor's sharp cheekbones, holding a toddler with wild curls and bright eyes. The little girl in the photos wore a tiny silver necklace identical to the one now around Grace's throat. This was Catherine at 22, Eleanor said softly, touching a photo of the woman pushing a swing set in what looked like a private garden. You were almost 2 here, just learning to say full sentences. You called her Mama Cat because you couldn't pronounce Catherine. Grace traced the photograph with trembling fingers. The toddler's face was unmistakably her own, the same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting her head when curious. But it was the necklace that made her heart pound. In the photo, it gleamed new and bright against tiny overalls. "Tell me about the man she married," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father." Eleanor's expression darkened. "Michael Torres. Charming, handsome, completely unsuitable. He was a journalist, covering the waterfront development story where Davenport Shipping was the primary contractor. Catherine met him at a press conference, and within 6 months they were inseparable." Grace detected something carefully controlled in Eleanor's tone. "You didn't approve. He was after our money. I was certain of it." Eleanor pulled out another file, this one thick with newspaper clippings and background check documents. Michael had gambling debts, a history of relationships with wealthy women, a pattern of moving on when the money dried up. I forbade Catherine from seeing him, but she married him anyway, in Las Vegas on her 21st birthday, the day she gained access to her trust fund. Eleanor's voice carried decades of regret. They moved into a small apartment in Cambridge, and Michael convinced Catherine that I was trying to control her life, poison their love, steal her happiness. Grace studied a photograph of her parents' wedding, Catherine radiant in a simple white dress, Michael dark-haired and smiling, both of them looking young and defiant and completely in love. Maybe he really loved her. Eleanor was quiet for so long Grace thought she wouldn't respond. Finally, maybe he did. I've had 29 years to consider that possibility, and it's the one that haunts me most. What do you mean? Eleanor moved to the window, her silhouette sharp against the golden garden light. If Michael was a con man, then Catherine and you were simply victims of a predator. But if he loved her, then I destroyed my daughter's marriage through stubborn pride and drove away the only family I had left. The weight of that confession settled between them like physical presence. Grace understood now why Eleanor had spent decades searching, not just for her lost family, but for absolution from the possibility that her own actions had caused their disappearance. The night they left, Eleanor continued, Catherine came to see me. She begged me to accept Michael, to give them my blessing, to be part of their life. And Eleanor's voice broke. I told her if she stayed married to that man, she was no daughter of mine. Grace felt tears burn her eyes as the picture completed itself. A proud, terrified young mother taking her child and running from a grandmother who had chosen control over love, protection over acceptance. So she took me and left Boston. They drove away at 3 in the morning. Catherine's car was found abandoned in Providence 2 days later. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. They simply disappeared into America, and I was too proud to hire investigators for the first year because I kept expecting them to come home. Eleanor turned back from the window, and Grace saw in her face the accumulated weight of 29 years of regret, hope, and desperate love. By the time I swallowed my pride and started searching, the trail had gone completely cold, until today, when I looked up and saw Catherine's necklace around her daughter's neck. The DNA testing facility on Newbury Street looked more like an upscale medical spa than a laboratory that could reshape her. Lives with a cheek swab and a 3-day wait. Eleanor had arranged for the private consultation within hours of their decision to seek definitive proof, her influence opening doors that usually required weeks of appointment scheduling. The results will be conclusive, Dr. Sarah Kim assured them as she prepared the simple test. Grandmother-grandchild relationships show distinct genetic markers that are impossible to mistake. Grace watched the cotton swab disappear into its sterile container, carrying with it cells that might prove she was Grace Catherine Davenport, heir to a shipping fortune, granddaughter to one of New England's most powerful women, or they might prove she was still just Grace Thompson, abandoned foster child, perpetually overworked nurse, owner of nothing more valuable than a mysteriously similar necklace. 3 days, Dr. Kim repeated as they left the facility. The results will be available Friday afternoon. 3 days felt simultaneously like an eternity, and nowhere near enough time to prepare for an answer that would change everything. They spent Wednesday at Eleanor's lawyer's office, a partnership that occupied 3 floors of a downtown Boston high-rise, where men in $1,000 suits spoke in careful legal language about trust funds, inheritance structures, and the complexities of proving identity after nearly 3 decades. If the DNA confirms relationship, senior partner James Morrison explained, there are still significant hurdles. Grace would need to petition the court to have her legal identity updated, provide evidence of her abandonment and subsequent foster care, establish continuity of existence. Grace felt increasingly overwhelmed by the legal labyrinth that surrounded her possible new identity. Eleanor, however, listened with sharp attention, asking pointed questions about timelines, required documentation, and potential challenges from distant relatives who might contest Grace's claim to the Davenport legacy. How long would the process take? Eleanor asked. Assuming no contests and clean documentation? 6 to 8 months, with complications? Potentially years. That evening, back in Eleanor's library, they worked through photo albums and family documents by firelight. Eleanor had retrieved boxes from storage, decades of Catherine's childhood, preserved in meticulous detail. School reports, art projects, birthday parties, family vacations to Martha's Vineyard and European capitals. Catherine was brilliant, Eleanor said, showing Grace a report card filled with perfect marks. She spoke 3 languages by age 12, could debate philosophy with my graduate student friends, wrote poetry that made me cry. Eleanor's voice grew wistful. But she was also rebellious, passionate, absolutely convinced she knew better than everyone around her. Grace studied photographs of her possible mother at various ages, a serious child with intelligent eyes, a gawky teenager with metal braces and defiant expression, a young woman who grew into her beauty, like she was claiming it as birthright. She looks like you, Eleanor observed, comparing a photo of teenage Catherine to Grace's face in the lamplight. But you have something Catherine never quite managed. What's that? Peace. Catherine was always fighting something. Expectations, limitations, her own restless energy. You seem settled, content with who you are. Grace considered this. Maybe because I never had expectations to fight against. Foster care teaches you to be grateful for what you have. Or maybe, Eleanor said softly, you inherited your grandfather's temperament, instead of the Davenport stubborn streak that destroyed my relationship with Catherine. Grace looked up from the photograph she'd been studying. You never mentioned my grandfather. Eleanor's expression grew tender in a way Grace hadn't seen before. Robert Davenport died when Catherine was 15, but he would have loved you instantly. He was the one who taught me that family is about love and acceptance, not control and expectation. I forgot those lessons after he died, became the Ice Queen everyone calls me now. They worked until nearly midnight, building a picture of the family Grace might belong to, generations of Davenports who had built shipping empires, funded hospitals, endowed universities. But also a family marked by tragedy, loss and the kind of pride that could destroy relationships with surgical precision. Thursday crawled by in a haze of nervous energy. Grace had called in sick to the hospital, earning her another mark against her in Patricia Mills's mental ledger. But Eleanor insisted they use the time to visit places that might trigger memories. They walked through Boston Common, where Eleanor claimed she had pushed Catherine on swings and taught her to feed ducks. They visited the Children's Museum, the Science Museum, Fenway Park, places where a grandmother might have taken a beloved grandchild for special outings. At the harbor, standing where Davenport Shipping's headquarters had once operated, before moving to modern facilities in the Seaport District, Eleanor grew quiet. I built all of this thinking I was creating something to pass to Catherine, then to you, she said, watching sailboats navigate around commercial traffic. Instead, I drove away the people I was building it for, Maybe you still have a chance to pass it on, Grace said carefully. Eleanor turned to study her face. Would you want it? The responsibility, the pressure, the public scrutiny that comes with the Davenport name. Grace touched the necklace at her throat, feeling the weight of the question. I don't know. I've spent my whole life believing I was nobody special, that my greatest achievement would be completing nursing school and maybe saving enough to buy a small house someday. The idea that I might be all of this, she gestured at the harbor, the city skyline, the legacy surrounding them. It's terrifying. Fear is reasonable, Eleanor said. But Grace, whether you choose to claim the Davenport inheritance or not, you are someone special. You're compassionate, intelligent, stronger than you realize. Those qualities don't come from money or family names. They come from who you choose to be. As they walked back to Eleanor's car, Grace felt the weight of Friday approaching like an incoming storm. In less than 24 hours, she would know definitively whether she was Eleanor's granddaughter or simply a woman who happened to possess a mysteriously identical piece of jewelry. Either way, she realized her life had already changed irrevocably. She had spent 3 days living in a world where she might belong to someone, where her existence mattered, beyond her ability to work long hospital shifts and pay her small apartment's rent on time. The question now wasn't just about DNA results. It was about whether she was brave enough to claim the life that might be waiting for her, regardless of what the science said. Friday afternoon arrived with the weight of destiny pressing against Grace's shoulders as she sat beside Eleanor in Dr. Kim's pristine office, both women maintaining careful composure while their worlds hung in the balance of genetic science. Dr. Kim entered with a manila folder that seemed to contain the power to rewrite history. The results are conclusive, she announced, settling behind her desk with the careful precision of someone who delivered life-changing news regularly. The DNA analysis confirms a grandmother-grandchild relationship with 99.7% probability. The words hit Grace like a physical force, stealing her breath and making the room swim slightly around its edges. Beside her, Eleanor made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh or both combined into something purely human and raw. You're certain? Eleanor's voice barely qualified as a whisper. Absolutely certain. Grace is your biological granddaughter. Dr. Kim smiled warmly. The genetic markers are unmistakable. Congratulations to you both. Grace stared at the official report, with its charts and percentages and clinical language that somehow made her transformation from nobody to somebody feel antiseptic rather than miraculous. What happens now? Now, Eleanor said, her voice stronger than it had been all week. We go home. You're home. They drove back to Beacon Hill in emotional silence, both women processing the reality that had just solidified around them. Grace was Grace Catherine Davenport, missing heiress to a shipping fortune, granddaughter to one of Boston's most powerful women. The abandoned foster child who had spent 29 years believing she was unwanted now knew she had been desperately searched for across 3 decades. Mrs. Chen, Eleanor's housekeeper, greeted them with champagne and tears, having clearly been briefed on the day's significance. Miss Grace, she said warmly, your room is ready. I've prepared your grandmother's favorite dinner to celebrate. Your grandmother. The words settled over Grace like an entirely new skin she wasn't sure how to wear yet. Eleanor led her to a bedroom on the 2nd floor that had clearly been prepared with hope rather than expectation. Fresh flowers, expensive linens, a sitting area by tall windows that overlooked the private garden. This was Catherine's room, Eleanor explained. I've kept it exactly as she left it, except for updating the bathroom and adding modern conveniences. Grace moved through the space like she was touring a museum of her mother's life. The bookshelf held titles ranging from classic literature to social justice manifestos. The desk contained teenage journals with entries that revealed a passionate, idealistic young woman who dreamed of changing the world through journalism and activism. The closet held clothes that would fit Grace perfectly. Designer pieces that had been waiting nearly 3 decades for someone to claim them. She would be so proud of who you've become, Eleanor said from the doorway. A healer, someone who dedicates her life to caring for others. That's the woman I raised her to be, before pride and stubbornness got in the way. Grace sat on the bed that had once been her mother's, holding a framed photograph she'd found on the nightstand, Catherine at her college graduation. radiant with possibility, wearing the silver necklace that now hung around Grace's throat. Tell me what she was like as a person, not just as your daughter. Eleanor settled into the window seat, her expression growing soft with memory. Catherine was fire and water combined, passionate enough to fight for her beliefs, but gentle enough to spend hours reading to children at the local hospital. She volunteered at homeless shelters, organized fundraisers for environmental causes, wrote letters to politicians about social justice issues. Eleanor paused. She was everything I taught her to be, and everything I was too afraid to become myself. What do you mean? I inherited the Davenport fortune young and learned early that showing vulnerability was dangerous in business. I became calculating, controlling, protective of our wealth and status. Catherine inherited the same passionate heart as her grandfather, but I tried to teach her to suppress it for the sake of social expectations. Grace understood now why her mother had fought so hard against Eleanor's disapproval of Michael Torres. She was trying to choose love over expectation, yes, and I was too proud to see that Michael might have brought out the best in her rather than destroying her future. Eleanor moved to sit beside Grace on the bed. I've spent 29 years wondering if they were happy together, if I drove away a son-in-law who actually deserved Catherine's love. That evening, they called James Morrison to begin the legal process of establishing Grace's identity and claim to the Davenport inheritance. The conversation was lengthy and complex, involving document requests, court filings, and media management strategies. The story will break within days once we file the initial paperwork, Morrison warned. Missing heiress found after 3 decades, reunited with billionaire grandmother. The press will be relentless. Grace felt panic rise in her throat. I'm not ready for that kind of attention. We'll control the narrative, Eleanor said firmly. Exclusive interview with one reputable journalist, official statement through our PR firm, then complete privacy until the legal process concludes. What about the hospital? Grace asked. I need to resign properly, tie up loose ends with my patients. Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful. Actually, I have a different proposal. Boston General's cardiac wing needs renovation and updated equipment. What if the Davenport Foundation funded a complete modernization project with the condition that you oversee the nursing staff training and patient care protocols? Grace stared at her grandmother. The word still felt foreign but increasingly right, with growing amazement. You want me to keep working as a nurse? I want you to do whatever makes you happy. But Grace, you have skills and experience that could benefit thousands of patients. Why not use the Davenport resources to amplify your ability to help people? The idea was intoxicating, remaining in the profession she loved while having the resources to actually improve patient care, upgrade equipment, hire adequate staff. She could transform the working conditions that had made her feel invisible and undervalued. Patricia Mills would hate that, Grace said, surprised to find herself smiling at the thought. Eleanor's grin was sharp as winter wind. Patricia Mills is about to discover that underestimating people based on their perceived social status can be a career-limiting mistake. As Grace prepared for bed in her mother's room, surrounded by evidence of the family she'd always yearned for, she felt the final pieces of her old identity dissolving like sugar in warm water. Tomorrow she would return to Boston General, not as Grace Thompson, dispensable staff member, but as Grace Catherine Davenport, granddaughter to a woman who could reshape institutions with a phone call. But more importantly, she would return as someone who finally knew where she belonged and was ready to claim the space that had been waiting for her all along. Monday morning at Boston General felt like stepping onto a stage where Grace had memorized everyone else's lines but was about to perform an entirely different play. She walked through the familiar automated doors wearing her usual scrubs, carrying the same worn messenger bag, but everything had changed in the cellular deep way that DNA confirmation could alter reality. Eleanor's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Grace would work her regular shift while Eleanor attended a previously scheduled meeting with the hospital's board of directors. By afternoon, the power dynamics that had defined Grace's professional life for 8 years would be permanently recalibrated. Thompson! Patricia Mills's voice cut across the nurse's station like a blade. You've been absent 3 days without proper medical documentation. That's grounds for disciplinary action. Grace turned to face her supervisor, feeling a strange calm settle over her shoulders like armor. "I apologize for any inconvenience, Patricia. I had urgent family matters that required immediate attention." Patricia's laugh was sharp with disdain. "Family matters? You don't have family. Don't insult my intelligence with obvious lies." The familiar shame that would usually follow such words was notably absent. Instead, Grace felt something new rising in her chest, not anger but certainty. She touched the silver necklace at her throat, drawing strength from its weight and meaning. "You're right that I've been unclear about my family situation," Grace said calmly. "That will be corrected very soon." Before Patricia could respond, Dr. Harrison approached with his usual brisk efficiency. But Grace noticed something different in his demeanor, a subtle deference that hadn't been there the previous week. "Nurse Thompson," he said carefully, "I understand you'll be meeting with administration this afternoon regarding your role in the upcoming cardiac wing renovation project." Patricia's eyebrows shot up. "Renovation project? What renovation project?" Dr. Harrison glanced between them with obvious discomfort. "The Davenport Foundation has proposed a comprehensive modernization of our cardiac facilities. Nurse Thompson has been recommended to oversee the nursing protocol's integration." The color drained from Patricia's face as the implications registered. The Davenport Foundation meant Eleanor Davenport, which meant influence that could reshape entire hospital departments with a single phone call. "I don't understand," Patricia said slowly. "Why would the Davenport Foundation know anything about Thompson?" Grace felt the moment crystallize around her like winter air, clear, sharp, and absolutely decisive. "Because Eleanor Davenport is my grandmother, Patricia, and she's very interested in improving working conditions for the nursing staff." The silence that followed was so complete, Grace could hear the cardiac monitors beeping in distant patient rooms. Dr. Harrison's eyes widened with dawning comprehension, while Patricia's face cycled through disbelief, calculation, and barely concealed panic. "That's impossible," Patricia whispered. "You're nobody. You're just what?" Grace's voice remained calm, but steel had entered its foundation. "Just someone you've spent 8 years treating as disposable. Just someone whose dedication and experience you've systematically undervalued." Dr. Harrison stepped forward diplomatically. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in a more private setting." "No," Grace interrupted, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. "I think this conversation needs witnesses." She looked directly at Patricia, seeing her supervisor clearly for the first time, not as an intimidating authority figure, but as someone whose power had always been borrowed and was about to be permanently revoked. "Patricia, for 8 years you've made it clear that I don't belong among the hospital's elite staff. You've questioned my competence, dismissed my suggestions, and treated me like an inconvenience rather than a professional colleague." Grace paused, letting each word land with precision. "Now you're going to discover what happens when someone you've underestimated has the resources to address those systemic problems directly." The nursing staff had gathered at the edges of their conversation, drawn by the unprecedented sight of quiet Grace Thompson directly confronting their supervisor. Grace felt their attention like spotlights, but instead of the usual shrinking sensation, she experienced something powerful and new. The realization that she was finally speaking for every nurse who had ever been dismissed, overworked, or treated as replaceable. The Davenport Foundation's renovation project will include updated equipment, improved staffing ratios, and comprehensive review of management practices, Grace continued. "We'll be implementing evidence-based protocols for patient care, professional development opportunities for nursing staff, and accountability measures for supervisory personnel." Patricia's mouth opened and closed without sound, her usual sharp retorts apparently stolen by the magnitude of what she was hearing. Dr. Harrison looked fascinated rather than concerned, clearly recognizing the potential benefits of Davenport funding for his department. "Furthermore," Grace said, her confidence growing with each word, "I'll be establishing a patient advocacy program that ensures every person who enters this hospital receives dignified, compassionate care regardless of their insurance status, social background, or perceived importance." The last phrase was aimed directly at Patricia, who had spent years treating patients differently, based on their ability to pay or their social connections. Grace watched recognition flash across her supervisor's face, The understanding that her career-long pattern of discrimination was about to be systematically dismantled. Mrs. Davenport will be joining the hospital board as a major donor, Grace continued, and she's particularly interested in nursing staff retention and job satisfaction metrics. I imagine there will be comprehensive interviews with current staff about their experiences with management. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Patricia's eyes darted around the gathering crowd of nurses, many of whom were now smiling with barely concealed satisfaction. 8 years of accumulated grievances against their supervisor had just found their champion. This is unbelievable, Patricia stammered. It's completely believable, said a familiar voice from behind them. Eleanor Davenport approached with the measured pace of someone accustomed to commanding attention simply by entering a room. She wore an elegant navy suit and carried herself with the quiet authority that came from decades of moving in Boston's highest social circles. Mrs. Davenport, Dr. Harrison stepped forward eagerly. We weren't expecting you until this afternoon's meeting. Eleanor's smile was gracious, but her eyes remained focused on Patricia Mills. I wanted to personally observe the working environment before making final decisions about our foundation's investment in this facility. Her gaze traveled over the assembled nursing staff, taking in their expressions of surprise, hope, and anticipation. I'm particularly interested in how staff members treat each other and their patients. The implication hung in the air like storm clouds. Patricia Mills, who had built her career on intimidating subordinates and currying favor with superiors, now found herself facing someone whose power was absolute and whose granddaughter she had systematically mistreated for nearly a decade. Grace touched her necklace one final time, feeling its silver warmth against her throat, and realized she was no longer the abandoned foster child who had accepted mistreatment as inevitable. She was Grace Catherine Davenport, and she was home. The hospital's main conference room had been transformed into an arena where decades of suppressed dignity would finally meet their moment of reckoning. Eleanor sat at the head of the polished mahogany table with the natural authority of someone who had commanded boardrooms across 3 continents, while Grace took her place at Eleanor's right hand, a positioning that spoke volumes about the power shift everyone was struggling to comprehend. Hospital Administrator Dr. Margaret Chen, no relation to Eleanor's housekeeper, presided over the meeting with visible nervousness, clearly aware that the Davenport Foundation's potential $20 million investment could reshape Boston General's entire future. Around the table sat department heads, senior physicians, and, at Eleanor's specific request, the complete nursing supervisory staff, including Patricia Mills, who looked like she was attending her own execution. The Davenport Foundation has identified Boston General as an ideal partner for our new Patient Care Excellence Initiative, Eleanor began, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to reshaping institutions through strategic philanthropy. However, our investment is contingent upon comprehensive review of current practices, particularly in areas of staff management and patient advocacy. Dr. Chen leaned forward eagerly. Mrs. Davenport, we're honored by your interest in our facility. What specific areas would the Foundation like to address? Eleanor's gaze found Grace, passing an almost imperceptible signal between grandmother and granddaughter. I'll let my advisor, Grace Davenport, outline our preliminary findings and recommendations. The use of Grace's full name, Grace Davenport, not Thompson, sent ripples of recognition through the room. Several board members exchanged glances as they processed the implications of Eleanor's advisor sharing her surname. Grace stood, feeling the weight of every person in the room focused on her transformation, from invisible staff member to Davenport family representative. Our assessment has identified several critical areas requiring immediate attention, she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. First, nursing staff retention rates indicate systemic management problems that directly impact patient care quality. Exit interviews reveal patterns of workplace intimidation, inequitable treatment based on perceived social status, and failure to recognize professional contributions. Patricia Mills visibly paled as Grace's words painted an unmistakable picture of her management style without naming specific individuals. Second, patient care protocols show concerning disparities based on insurance status and social background. The Foundation cannot support an institution where treatment quality varies according to patients' perceived importance rather than medical need. Dr. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. What specific changes would the Foundation require? Grace consulted the folder Eleanor had prepared, though she had memorized every detail. Complete restructuring of nursing management, with emphasis on collaborative leadership rather than hierarchical intimidation. Implementation of anonymous reporting systems for workplace discrimination. Mandatory bias training for all supervisory personnel, and establishment of patient advocacy protocols that ensure dignified care regardless of socioeconomic status. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Patricia Mills finally found her voice. These recommendations seem to target specific individuals rather than addressing systemic issues. Eleanor's smile was sharp as winter moonlight. Systemic issues manifest through individual behaviors, Ms. Mills. The Foundation's research has been quite thorough regarding management practices in the nursing department. Research. Patricia's voice cracked slightly. We interviewed current and former staff members about their experiences, Grace said calmly. The patterns were remarkably consistent. Stories of talented nurses driven away by hostile work environments. Patients treated differently based on their ability to pay. Professional contributions dismissed based on perceived social class. Grace paused, letting her words settle like evidence presented to a jury. For instance, we documented multiple cases where nursing staff suggestions for improved patient care were ignored or rejected, only to be implemented later when proposed by higher status individuals. Dr. Chen looked increasingly uncomfortable. Mrs. Davenport, if there are specific performance issues with staff members, those should be addressed through proper HR channels. Dr. Chen, Eleanor interrupted smoothly, the Foundation is not interested in punitive measures. We're interested in transformational change. The $20 million we're prepared to invest will fund new equipment, expanded staffing, and comprehensive culture renovation. But we need assurance that our investment will create lasting improvement rather than superficial compliance. Patricia Mills straightened in her chair, clearly recognizing that her career was balanced on a knife's edge. Mrs. Davenport, I want you to know that I've always maintained the highest professional standards. Have you? Grace's question cut through Patricia's protest like surgical steel. Because our research suggests otherwise. Grace opened her folder and withdrew a document that made Patricia's face go completely white. This is a compilation of complaints filed against nursing supervisory staff over the past 5 years. 97% involve a single supervisor. The complaints describe patterns of discrimination, workplace bullying, and patient care disparities. The room's atmosphere grew electric with tension. Board members leaned forward to study the document Grace placed on the table, their expressions growing increasingly concerned as they absorbed the implications of what they were reading. These complaints were filed with HR, but never properly investigated, Grace continued. Staff members were told to work it out or adjust their attitudes rather than receiving meaningful support for legitimate workplace concerns. Dr. Chen's face had flushed red with embarrassment and growing anger, though Grace sensed the anger was directed at discovering these issues rather than at their exposure. Furthermore, Eleanor added, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, the Foundation discovered that several excellent nurses transferred to competing hospitals, specifically to escape hostile management. Boston General has lost significant talent due to completely preventable workplace toxicity. Patricia Mills made one final attempt to salvage her position. I'm sure any perceived problems can be addressed through additional training and clearer communication protocols. Ms. Mills, Eleanor's voice carried the finality of a closing door. The Foundation has already made its decision regarding personnel changes necessary for our partnership with Boston General. Dr. Chen, we'll need to discuss transition timelines and replacement procedures in our private session. The dismissal was absolute and public. Patricia Mills sat frozen as the reality crystallized around her. 29. Years of accumulated mistreatment of a woman she'd considered. Powerless, had just ended her career in the most thorough way possible. Grace felt a moment of something that might have been sympathy, but it passed quickly as she remembered every nurse who had been driven away, every patient who had received substandard care. Every day she'd had to swallow Patricia's condescension and disrespect. Justice, she realized, wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that patterns of harm couldn't continue unchecked. The transformation was complete. Grace Catherine Davenport had not only claimed her inheritance, but had wielded it to protect others who couldn't protect themselves. The transformation of Boston General's 7th floor began within hours of the board meeting's conclusion. Patricia Mills cleared out her office with the swift efficiency of someone who recognized that fighting the inevitable would only increase the magnitude of her professional destruction. Grace watched from the nurse's station as her former supervisor carried boxes of personal items to the elevator. Their eyes meeting briefly in a moment of mutual understanding, the underestimated had become the untouchable. "I still can't believe it," whispered Maria Santos, Grace's closest colleague among the nursing staff. "Grace Thompson is Grace Davenport." The Grace Davenport. Missing heiress to a shipping fortune, granddaughter to one of the most powerful women in New England. "Just Grace," Grace corrected gently, though she understood Maria's amazement. The revelation had spread through the hospital faster than morning gossip, transforming her from invisible staff member to the local legend in the space of a single afternoon. Dr. Harrison approached with the careful respect of someone recalibrating his entire understanding of hospital hierarchy. "Grace, Mrs. Davenport is meeting with the architectural team about the renovation timeline. She's requested your input on the nursing station redesign." Grace nodded, still adjusting to being consulted rather than simply receiving orders. The proposed changes were comprehensive: expanded patient rooms, state-of-the-art monitoring equipment, nursing stations designed for efficiency rather than administrative control, and private consultation areas where families could receive difficult news with dignity. "The timeline is ambitious," Dr. Harrison continued. "Mrs. Davenport wants the first phase completed within 6 months. The foundation is providing temporary staffing to maintain patient care during construction." Eleanor had thought of everything, Grace realized. Not just the physical improvements, but the human elements that would make the transition successful. Temporary staff to prevent overwork, relocation assistance for displaced patients, even counseling services for nursing staff who had been affected by years of workplace toxicity. "Dr. Harrison," Grace said carefully, "I want to establish a patient advocacy program as part of the renovation. Every patient deserves an advocate who ensures their concerns are heard and addressed, regardless of their ability to pay or their social connections. The Foundation has already approved funding for that program." Dr. Harrison smiled. "Mrs. Davenport mentioned it was your particular priority." Eleanor appeared in the doorway of the conference room, her presence commanding immediate attention despite her elegant understatement. "Grace, could you join us? The architects have questions about the nursing workflow optimization." As Grace followed her grandmother into the conference room filled with plans and blueprints, she marveled at how quickly Eleanor had mobilized resources to address problems that had festered for years. The Davenport influence wasn't just about money. It was about the ability to cut through bureaucratic inertia and implement solutions with surgical precision. The patient advocacy program, Eleanor was explaining to the assembled team, will be staffed by nursing professionals who report directly to the Davenport Foundation rather than hospital administration. This ensures independence and prevents conflicts of interest. Grace recognized the subtle genius of the structure: advocates who couldn't be pressured or dismissed by hospital administrators, funded by a foundation wealthy enough to guarantee their independence indefinitely. Later that afternoon, as Grace made her rounds on the 7th floor, she noticed how differently people were treating her, not with the deference shown to Eleanor's wealth and power, but with something more valuable: respect for who she had always been, finally visible now that her true identity provided context for her quiet strength and professional competence. Mrs. Eleanor Davenport, her patient, not her grandmother during working hours, was recovering well from the cardiac procedure they had postponed the previous week. "How are you adjusting to all this attention?" Eleanor asked when Grace checked her vital signs. "It's overwhelming," Grace admitted. "This morning I was nobody special. Now people are treating me like I've somehow changed when I'm still the same person I was yesterday." Eleanor's smile was warm with understanding. "You were always special, Grace. You were always worthy of respect and recognition. The difference is that now people can see it because social expectations have given them permission to look. The insight was both liberating and deeply sad that her professional competence, her compassionate patient care, her 8 years of dedicated service had been invisible until her surname provided the social context that made her contributions valuable. "What happens now?" Grace asked. "After the renovation is complete, after the media attention dies down, after people get used to the idea that Grace Thompson was actually Grace Davenport all along." Eleanor considered the question seriously. "Now you get to decide who you want to become. You have resources most people can only dream of: money, influence, social connections, educational opportunities. But more importantly, you have something money can't buy: genuine compassion and the rare ability to use power to help others rather than accumulate more power." That evening, Grace stood on the balcony of her mother's room in Eleanor's Beacon Hill mansion, looking out over Boston's twinkling lights and processing the magnitude of her life's transformation. The silver necklace at her throat caught the evening light, no longer a mysterious remnant of an unknown past, but a bridge connecting her to a family legacy of both great privilege and great responsibility. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "The whole nursing staff is planning a celebration dinner tomorrow night. We want to toast the woman who finally gave Patricia Mills what she deserved and made all our working lives better. You're our hero, Grace." Hero. The word felt strange but not unwelcome. Grace had spent her entire adult life caring for others, but always from a position of powerlessness, always dependent on the approval of supervisors who saw her as replaceable. Now she had the resources to systematically address the problems that made healthcare workers feel invisible and undervalued. She touched the necklace, feeling its familiar weight, but now it carried new significance. It wasn't just a connection to her mother and grandmother. It was a reminder that sometimes the most valuable treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true worth. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, using the Davenport legacy to create lasting change, not just for her own benefit, but for every patient who deserved dignified care and every nurse who deserved professional respect. The abandoned foster child had finally come home, and she was ready to transform that home into something worthy of the love that had searched for her across 3 decades of separation. 6 months later, Grace stood in the newly renovated cardiac wing of Boston General Hospital, watching the morning shift change with quiet satisfaction. The transformation was complete, not just of the physical space, with its state-of-the-art equipment and patient-centered design, but of the entire culture that governed how people treated each other within these walls. The nurses moved with confidence rather than fear, their suggestions valued and implemented rather than dismissed. Patients from all backgrounds received the same level of attentive care, their dignity protected by advocacy protocols that had become a model for hospitals across New England. The oppressive hierarchy that had once made Grace feel invisible had been replaced by collaborative leadership that recognized expertise regardless of social status or surname. Eleanor approached from the administrative offices, where she had just completed the final inspection with the hospital board. At 82, she moved with the energy of someone who had discovered a new purpose after decades of isolation. "The patient satisfaction scores are the highest in the hospital's history," she announced with evident pride. "More importantly, nursing staff retention is up 60%, and we have a waiting list of qualified professionals who want to transfer here." Grace smiled, watching Maria Santos orient a new nurse to the updated protocols. Maria had been promoted to supervisor after Patricia Mills' departure, bringing to the role the collaborative leadership style that Grace had helped develop through the Foundation's management training program. "The best part," Grace said, "is seeing how the changes have spread beyond our department. The other wings are requesting similar renovations and adopting our patient advocacy model." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "Power used wisely creates ripple effects. Your mother would be so proud of what you've built here." The mention of Catherine no longer brought pain, but rather a sense of connection to the passionate young woman who had fought against injustice even when it cost her everything. Grace had established the Catherine Davenport Memorial Fund for Healthcare Advocacy. ensuring her mother's idealistic spirit would live on through concrete improvements in patient care. Dr. Harrison appeared with his usual brisk efficiency, but his demeanor toward Grace had evolved into genuine collegial respect. "Grace, the medical school is requesting another presentation on your patient advocacy model. Harvard wants to incorporate it into their nursing program curriculum." The recognition still felt surreal. Grace Catherine Davenport had become a sought-after speaker on healthcare reform, her unique perspective as both frontline nurse and foundation executive, providing credibility that academic theorists couldn't match. She had testified before state legislative committees, consulted with medical schools, and advised other hospitals on implementing similar programs. But her favorite moments were still the quiet ones, sitting with patients who needed someone to listen, training new advocates to recognize and address systemic inequities, working alongside nurses who no longer had to choose between speaking up for patients and protecting their own job security. "Mrs. Davenport," called a familiar voice. Grace turned to see Janet Morrison, a former colleague who had left Boston General 2 years earlier due to the toxic work environment under Patricia Mills's supervision. Janet had returned as part of the expanded nursing staff, drawn back by reports of the cultural transformation. "Just Grace," Grace corrected automatically, though she had learned to accept the formal address from staff, who insisted on acknowledging her dual role as both colleague and foundation executive. "I wanted to thank you," Janet continued, her voice thick with emotion, "not just for the job, but for proving that speaking up for patients doesn't have to be career suicide. You've given us all permission to be advocates again." As Janet returned to her duties, Eleanor placed a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder. "Do you ever regret how everything changed? The privacy you lost, the complexity of your new responsibilities, the scrutiny that comes with the Davenport name?" Grace considered the question while watching the bustling activity of the cardiac wing. Nurses conferring with doctors as equals, patients receiving attentive care regardless of their insurance status, families finding comfort in private consultation areas designed for difficult conversations. "I regret the time we lost," she said finally. 29 years when you were alone, searching for family that was hidden in plain sight. All the patients who received substandard care because no one felt empowered to advocate for them. All the nurses who left healthcare because they couldn't tolerate working in toxic environments. She touched the silver necklace at her throat, its weight now familiar and comforting rather than mysterious. "But I don't regret finding out who I really am. Not just Grace Davenport, heiress to a fortune, but Grace Davenport, granddaughter to a woman who taught me that privilege comes with responsibility, and daughter to a woman who showed me that fighting for justice is worth whatever it costs." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she no longer tried to hide. "Your grandfather would have been so proud. He always said the measure of wealth isn't what you accumulate, but what you improve." As afternoon shifted toward evening, Grace completed her final rounds of the day, checking on patients who would receive excellent care regardless of their ability to pay, supervised by nurses who felt valued and empowered rather than replaceable and intimidated. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Emergency in room 705, but the good kind. Mrs. Patterson's family wants to thank the nurse who advocated for additional pain management when other staff said it wasn't necessary. They're calling you an angel." Grace smiled, remembering her first day back at the hospital when Eleanor had called her someone special. She had spent years believing she was nobody, that her greatest achievement might be completing nursing school and saving enough for a small house. Now she understood that she had always been exactly who she was meant to be, not because of her family name or inherited wealth, but because of her choice to use whatever power she possessed to protect and care for others. The silver necklace caught the corridor lights as she walked toward room 705, no longer a mystery from an unknown past, but a bridge connecting her to a legacy of love that had never truly been broken. Grace Catherine Davenport was finally home, and home was wherever she could make others feel seen, valued, and cared for. Sometimes the most precious treasures spend years hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true worth. And sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, but the opportunity to transform suffering into healing, invisibility into recognition, and abandonment into belonging. The truth had found its way to the surface, just as Eleanor had always believed it would. And in the process, It had transformed not just 2 lives, but an entire institution, proving that love, even love separated by decades of loss, never truly disappears. It simply waits, patient as silver, ready to shine when the time is right. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to remember that their true worth isn't determined by how others see them, but by the love and compassion they bring to the world. Sometimes the most ordinary people are hiding the most extraordinary hearts. We just need to look closely enough to see them.